There is a reason why we have nursing homes. We have them so that our seasoned citizens can live out the long, slow sunset of their mental faculties with their dignity more or less intact. Because who wants to go senile under the gaze of the whole population as well as the entire world news media? Which brings us to President and semi-animated cadaver Joe Biden and the worst speech of his entire political career. And for Joe Biden, that's really saying something, which he gave yesterday in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And the first thing you'll notice about this speech is that he delivered it while speaking into a handheld microphone, while standing at a lectern with two static microphones affixed to it, which made for a very strange visual effect. I can't say I've ever seen that before. Now, if you could take all of Joe Biden's weaknesses as a public speaker and all of his various shortcomings that arise from being a confused, doddering dotard with a brain made out of mashed potatoes and roll them into one majestic Back to the Future 3-style flaming train wreck of a speech, it would be this speech. If you've ever seen a late period Joe Biden speech before, you will already be familiar with his number one favorite rhetorical device, which goes like this. Joe says something that isn't remotely funny, then there is an awkward silence during which nobody laughs, and then Joe says, "I'm not joking, folks." He did that 6 times during this speech in Wilkes-Barre. 6! Does he not have any handlers who can tell him, begging your pardon, Mr. President, but you're not supposed to say, "I'm not joking," when the audience doesn't laugh at something that wasn't said with humorous intent? It's not something you say because they didn't laugh and you wish they had. It's kind of the opposite of when you should say that. And I guarantee you, when Joe starts playing fast and loose with the "I'm not joking" card, that causes his underlings to reach for the whiskey and tranquilizers because it means he has gone off prompter. And that means he's about to say something that is either indecipherably incoherent or shockingly racist. And he went for shockingly racist this time, as it happens. Joe decided the middle of this speech would be a great time to start telling anecdotes from his days growing up on the mean streets of Scranton, PA. And if there's anything we know about Joe Biden's childhood anecdotes, it's that they are always 100% true and not something he just made up on the spot for political convenience. Like that time he got arrested trying to bust Nelson Mandela out of prison, or that time in 1956 when Joe and his dad saw a couple of gay men tongue wrestling on the sidewalk, and Dad said, "That's what love looks like, Joey." And during this speech in Wilkes-Barre yesterday, Joe Biden decided it would be a great time to inform the country that when he thinks of black people, he thinks of crime and basketball. Probably cocaine and grape soda, too. Who knows? It could have been much worse, though, to be fair, because when he started segueing into a story that begins, "Well, that was the roughest part of town. I was the only white lifeguard, but that's where the best basketball games were." I thought for sure he was going to make some joke about black people not being good swimmers. I was also hoping, forlornly as it turns out, for a cameo appearance from our good friend Corn Pop. Because Corn Pop was a bad dude. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I used to run with a whole crew of gang enforcers named after breakfast cereals, you already know about Corn Pop, but there was also Sugar Smack, the dope dealer, Lucky Charm, the drunken Irish leg breaker, and Fruit Loop, because we were all about LGBT representation after all. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I guess it was naive of me to think I could unpack everything from this Joe Biden speech that requires unpacking within the constraints of an opening segment. Now, this was not your typical late period Joe Biden speech. Normally, he only plays a couple of the greatest hits. But he had the whole songbook working in Wilkes-Barre. He was reaching for the early career deep album cuts. The hardcore fans must have been delighted, but it was all there. The bulging veins in Charlottesville, the deer in their Kevlar vests, confusing the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence. Come on, Joe, you know the thing. And the still highly bizarre claim that Revolutionary-era Americans weren't allowed to own cannons. But It's one of the newer greatest hits that still has me rather flummoxed as to what it means and what using it is supposed to accomplish, and that is the epithet of ultra MAGA. According to Joe Biden, healing unifier of the nation, the absolute worst kind of human being you can be is something called an ultra MAGA Republican. Now, maybe this is just me, but trying to turn MAGA into a pejorative seems like a potentially very self-defeating enterprise. I don't know whether Joe remembers or not, or if he ever knew in the first place, but the letters in MAGA, need we remind ourselves, they stand for Make America Great Again. And what strange times in which we are living when saying you want your country to be great is viewed by the country's leaders as evidence of hatred or bigotry or intolerance or all of the above. MAGA Republicans, they hate democracy, says Joe Biden. They are a bunch of damned seditionists, domestic terrorists even, since if you express skepticism about any Democrat Party policy initiative, I think that makes one a domestic terrorist by default, according to the objective, impartial experts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is America's most cherished public institution, by the way. Only a democracy-hating monster would ever cast aspersions upon the professional integrity of the FBI. You know, since they have such an impeccable track record of never being a rogue agency that enjoys trying to blackmail and destroy presidents it doesn't like. It's not like Trump was the first one. And we are the only country in recorded world history whose people are routinely called racist and immoral just for saying they want their country to do well, to be peaceful and prosperous, to have secure sovereign borders and sensible immigration policy and energy independence, and maybe even public schools where the teachers are not a bunch of child-grooming sex perverts who want to hack off your son's testicles. And there is the entire MAGA agenda in one sentence. There's never been any great mystery about what Make America Great Again means, irrespective of how much any wild-eyed lunatic on leftist cable news enjoys lying about it. It's a dog whistle to racists, they howl. You know, because Donald Trump, a man who has never been renowned for his subtlety or his nuance, a man who by all appearances is incapable of not saying exactly what is on his mind at any given time, all of a sudden he has to start speaking in codes and dog whistles when he wants to mobilize his mob of white supremacist insurrectionists to go overthrow the government. So when he says, march down to the Capitol and make your voices peacefully heard, what he really means is, smash your way in, break a bunch of stuff, steal Nancy Pelosi's computer, publicly execute Mike Pence, and I'll be down there later this evening for my proclamation as Emperor for Life. Wait, co-emperor, I mean. Me and the guy with the furry horn helmet. We're going to share the job. It sounds absurd, because it damn well is absurd, but if you're a viewer of MSNBC or CNN or a reader of WAPO or the New York Times or a listener of NPR, you are bombarded each and every day by so-called analysts and commentators who tell you with perfectly straight faces that that is all real, that each and every one of Donald Trump's voters, all 75 million of them, is a filthy, racist bigot who wants to turn back the clock to the days of involuntary human servitude. And Joe Biden seems to be totally on board with all that stuff. Or, I guess it's more accurate to say the 30-year-old purple-haired millennial who writes Joe Biden's speeches seems to be totally on board with this stuff. And it's an interesting gambit, politically speaking. When you are the least popular president since Truman right after he fired MacArthur, when you're presiding over a collapsing economy that you keep pumping more and more fake money into despite claiming you want to stop inflation, and the best thing you can think to do to help your party in the midterms is to declare that all Republican voters and all Republican candidates even are irredeemable moral reprobates. Well, except Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Possibly Willard Romney, too. If you always vote with the Democrats and always support Democrat policy initiatives and never stand in the way as the country lurches farther and farther and farther to the left, decade after decade, well, then you're the good kind of Republican, obviously. And when Democrats talk about bipartisanship, they are not using the traditional dictionary definition of that word, which I assume will come as no shock since the number one rule of Democrat Party rhetoric is that when a word becomes rhetorically inconvenient, you just change the definition until it stops doing that. And so, while you and I grew up in a world where bipartisanship meant something along the lines of each side gets something they want, and they each give something up in return. That is not what bipartisanship means in the age of Joe Biden. In the age of Joe Biden, bipartisanship means give me every single thing I want or else I will call you a racist. But my favorite disingenuous use of that word came just recently with the passage of the hilariously named Inflation Reduction Act. The Senate vote was 50-50 with Vice President Kamala Harris, the California cackler, breaking the tie. The House vote broke exactly along party lines with two exceptions, and you know exactly who they were. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. This was an extremely divisive piece of legislation. It barely squeaked by on a 99% party line vote, but has that stopped Joe Biden and the idiots in his cabinet from running around every day since, hilariously referring to this thing as a bipartisan bill? I reached across the aisle, says Joe Biden, patting himself on the back furiously, because I am a moderate centrist, haven't you heard? I'm Joe the deal maker, Joe the ecumenicalist, Joe the compromiser. See what a great job I did bringing Republicans and Democrats together? And I think I see the opportunity here for a valuable object lesson. This, Mr. President, would be a fitting time to interject with, I'm not joking, because you said a thing that is self-evidently hilarious, but you didn't say it with comic intent. So it's likely the audience might laugh when they are not supposed to. So then it would be apropos to say, I'm not joking, folks. Now, to reiterate, it's a thing you say when you want to stifle unwanted laughter. It is not a thing you say because you're annoyed that nobody laughed at the thing you said that wasn't remotely funny in the first place. I feel like I shouldn't have to explain any of this to a man who has been ensconced in national politics since I was minus 2 years old, but what do you do? A last note on the MAGA thing. Donald Trump did not coin that phrase. Ronald Reagan did, when he was running in 1980 against Jimmy Carter, who was the worst president of my lifetime, until Joe Biden came along and quickly went about establishing himself as the worst president in all of history, period. But good luck trying to explain that to a Trump hater, because, number one, these are people who think 2004 is ancient history, and number two, they are so emotionally wrapped up in the idea of Make America Great Again being a statement of heinous bigotry and intolerance, a talisman of unvarnished moral evil, that they can't even bring themselves to contemplate the notion that someone other than Donald Trump might have said it before Trump did. And it sure as hell wasn't ever controversial when Reagan said it. It didn't occur to anybody in the Democrat Party in 1980 that wanting America to be great was a vile, evil, awful, bad thing, because why the hell wouldn't you want your country to be great? I imagine Guatemalans want their country to be great. I imagine Filipinos want their country to be great. I imagine people from Equatorial Guinea want their country to be great. Does anybody call them racist for thinking that? Nope. They do not. Why? Because that's fucking stupid. Wanting one's country to be great is a natural byproduct of being from a country. Mikhail Gorbachev, who passed away yesterday at the age of 91, he wanted his country to be great too. He was born and raised in the Soviet Union. He spent his whole adult life working in the government of the Soviet Union, so it was perfectly normal and natural that he should want the Soviet Union to do well, to maintain its greatness, insofar as preserving its post-war status as a world superpower. But Gorbachev also had an inquisitive mind, which is just about the worst trait that a communist can possess, and he also was pragmatic enough to see that Soviet communism, as it was constituted in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, was going to have a maximum shelf life of about 75 years. I've heard a lot of commentators today saying Gorbachev thought there was a way to thread the needle so that Soviet communism could be rehabilitated and preserved far into the future. But I don't think that's correct. In fact, I don't think Gorbachev's view of Soviet communism was all that much different from Vladimir Putin's. Both of those guys could see by the mid to late 70s that the system they had in place was unlikely to survive another 15 years. They were both cognizant of the reasons why a Marxist-Leninist system of government will always be doomed to failure. So when Gorbachev came out with the proposal for glasnost and perestroika, he was signaling the willingness of communists to move away from communism. He hoped this could be done in such a way that communism itself could be transitioned away from, but the country and its flag and its culture and its traditions might be able to remain. It wound up not working out that way, of course. First, the army tried to stage a coup in mid 1991 and get rid of Gorbachev because they'd had just about enough of this reform stuff, but the coup failed, largely because Boris Yeltsin, who was the premier of the Russian SFSR at that time, and had more moral authority than probably any man in the country, climbed up on top of that tank and told everybody to go the fuck home. So Gorbachev remains in office for another half a year or so, but his authority is vastly diminished. The constituent Soviet republics were starting to declare their independence. First the Baltic states, then Georgia, then Belarus, and then once the dominoes started falling, everybody pretty much started rushing for the exits. So Gorbachev was left with one final choice. Do I try to preserve the Soviet Union by force of arms? Or do I try to manage the dissolution of the country in such a way that it doesn't devolve into another 1917-style bloodbath? He chose the latter option, much to his credit, and if he is remembered fondly by history, it should be for that act. But if you read today's obituary in the New York Times, you might get the impression that the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War were all down to Gorbachev being such an enlightened man of wisdom and peace. Evidently, President Reagan had nothing at all to do with it, which is an interesting reading of history, I must say, because I seem to remember living in a world where everybody in the United States, Republican and Democrat alike, was happy coexisting with the Soviet Union forever and having a permanent, endless Cold War. And then Reagan comes in with a fresh set of eyes, having never lived in Washington, having never worked in the federal government, and he says, what are we doing here, guys? Do we want to win this thing? Do we want to smash communism, or do we want to sit around like a bunch of frightened pussies with our thumbs up our asses? And what did the establishment think about that? Well, they thought Reagan was an unhinged madman who was trying to cause nuclear Armageddon. The idea was even floated, and you will remember this if you were of the same vintage as the host, that because Reagan was such a firm believer in Christianity, then obviously he must have taken a literal reading of the book of Revelation, and he is trying to start a nuclear war because he thinks that will pave the way for the second coming of Christ. For years, they said that. Because fake news has been a thing for a long time. Pro-Democrat bias in the fake news media has been a thing for a long time. None of these things began on the day Trump came down the escalator. He may have brought matters to a head. He may have made these people's brains explode to the point where they had to stop pretending. But Trump derangement syndrome was not a phenomenon that suddenly emerged out of the cosmic ether one day in 2015. Long before there was Trump derangement syndrome, there was Reagan psychosis complex. In Reagan's first term, the narrative was this crazy Jesus-loving cowboy from California is going to blow up the entire world. And in his second term, the narrative was, this 73-year-old dotard is far too old and mentally enfeebled to continue being the president. Which is pretty damned amusing, since some of those same people today are pretending there is nothing wrong with Joe Biden's mental cognition. Meanwhile, in his two elections, Reagan won 45 states in 1980 and 49 states in 84, or 94 out of a possible 100 overall, which is to say there's not much that's new under the sun, including fake news performance art, including the ability of the American people to know when they are being lied to and to ignore the liars. And that is just about all I've got for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very kindly for watching. Do have a pleasant tomorrow. I will see you Friday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.